Let's go step by step and learn how you can create this with any text or logo of your choice. It'll be completely done in geometry nodes, and so without any further ado, let's begin the tutorial. In our default scene, we'll bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows over here, click and drag to create a new window, and we'll change it from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor. Then we'll press this plus button to create a new geometry node tree. We'll zoom in, select the group input, and press X to delete our default cube. Now we'll press Shift A and search for a string node, and we can't plug that directly into the group output, so we'll search for a string to curves node, and then plug the string into the string of the string to curve, and then we can connect this directly into the group output. Now we have to actually type in some string, so for now I'm just going to go with AIN, and that's what it looks like. However, I want to change the font and the positioning. So the first thing that I'm going to do is align the origin with the center horizontally and the center vertically as well. Then I'm going to select my font by pressing this button and opening the font that I want. So in this case, I'm going to go with Arial Round, and let's just click it from the Windows font folder and click open. The next thing that I want to do is actually resample the curve so that we have a fixed number of points. I'll show you why that happens, because if we were to convert this into a mesh that's visible in our renders, so if we switch off overlay, you see we can't currently see anything. So we have to eventually convert it into a mesh. We'll do that right now so that we see why we're doing what we're doing. So let's search for a curve to mesh node, plug that in, and for the profile curve, we'll search for a curve circle and we'll plug that in over here. Now obviously the radius of the circle is way too large, so we'll go and change the radius down to 0.01, and if you take a look at the Y, there's quite a bit of pinching happening over here, and that's because the actual points that come out from this particular string to curves is not evenly spaced. However, if you press Shift and search for a resample curve node and increase the count, you can see how that pinching of the Y is no longer there. So if you plug this in, you can see it gets pinched off. Even the E has some pinching over here. But if you pass it through the resample curve, it all gets fixed. So it's much better to use a resample curve node. And we'll keep the count at something really high, maybe 2000, while we do the final rendering. However, for now, I'm not going to use this resample curve node just so that I can preview the animation faster. So I'm going to tap M to mute it. Next, we'll pass this all the way to the edge because I want to do all of the motion before we actually convert it into a mesh. So how do we take care of the motion? We want each of these letters to move individually at independent times. We know that we can move the letters using a set position node, and because the string to curves gives out instances, each letter is a single instance. So the D has an index of 0, E has an index of 1. We can't access the individual points within the D or within the E or within the A as such. However, that's exactly what we want, because we want to make the entire D move together, the entire E move together, and so on. So we could just use a set position. However, this set position will move all of them together. So we have to select only one index, and for that we have to use the selection box. However, the selection box takes a boolean, and we want it to be true only if the index is the index of the letter that we want to move. So we know D has an index of 0, 1, 2, 3, and so on. So let's find out how we can do that. We can search for a compare node so that we can compare the index with the value that we want, and we need to search for an index node so that we get the actual index that's being moved, and we have to compare it with an integer, which is just a value node, and we can change this greater than node or the compare node from float to integer. Then plug both of these in, and now if we plug this into the selection, you can see the offset is working for everything greater than 0. However, we want it to work only for index 0, so we have to change this from greater than to equal. And now if we move it on the x-axis, you see only the D moves. Now this setup we can do 6 times for the 6 different letters. So let's take this, shift this to the side, take these 4, and then just press Shift D. So that's 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Then to connect these, if you have Node Wrangler switched on, you can just press Alt right click and just drag these to connect them up, which makes the process really fast. Lastly, you need this to connect up to the curves to mesh. So we can just click this and plug that in over here. Now we can change the actual compare value for all of them. So this is index 0. This has to be index 1. This is going to be index 2, 3, 4, and index number 5 is the end. So now that we've done all of those, we can move each of them individually on the y-axis, which is how we're going to do our animation. So to deal with the animation, first we'll just set our animation defaults by going to our output properties and changing the frame rate to 30 frames per second and the end frame to maybe 210 so that it's a 7-second long animation. Apart from that, you can choose your output folder accordingly. We'll do that later on, but since we're here, we'll just take care of it. File format is going to be FFmpeg video, encoder is going to be MPEG-4, and an output quality of perceptually lossless. Now that we have those, let's actually do the animation. So we'll bring our timeline up by a little bit so that we can have more region to play around with, and we'll press 7 on our keypad to go to the top view. Next, we actually want these curves to appear slowly at the beginning. So to make them appear, we can press Shift A and search for a trim curve node and plug that in over here. Now you see if you increase the start, they start disappearing. So initially on frame 1, the start value is also going to be at 1 so that they are literally not there at all. And then we're just going to press I while hovering hovering over the start to create a keyframe. Then let's say it takes 2 seconds for all of them to appear. We need to go to frame 60 and then change this start value all the way down to 0 and then hover over it and tap I. Now if you play the animation, you see they actually appear into frame. Now you could change the interpolation, but we'll deal with that a bit later. Then maybe 5 frames later, we can have these to start bouncing based on a ball, but we'll animate the ball later on. First, we'll get all of these to bounce. So to do that, we'll go to this set position node, or the first one, and on frame 65, we'll just hover over the Y and then right click and click insert single keyframe. So the reason we're doing that is because we don't want a keyframe on the X and the Z axes. We want it only on the Y axis. Then let's say it takes 20 seconds for it to finish bouncing up and down. So that would be frame 85, or in fact, to keep everything as round numbers, we'll just grab it and move it by 5 units so that it starts bouncing on frame 70, and then on frame 90 we want it to finish bouncing and settle down completely. So all we have to do is again hover over the Y and say insert single keyframe. Then down here we'll press A to make sure all the keyframes are selected, and then tap T and click on elastic. Now even though they're the exact same keyframes, it actually has some interpolation and you can see it bounce. So we need to change a few things about the bounce, and that is because right now when you play it, the bounce is very extreme. I want it to be a slightly subtler bounce, and I want it to damp out as well a bit faster. To change those, I'll press A to select the keyframes and then change this from the timeline to the graph editor. Now with the graph editor, you can actually see that you have a single keyframe which is on the Y value, and this is what it looks like. Now on the right hand side, you should have this panel. If it's not present, tap N to bring it back up, and then you can go to the F curve and just scroll down. Under the active keyframe section, you have an amplitude and period. So if you increase the period, you can see how it starts stretching out, and I think I'll go with the period of something like 12, and that should be fine. So that looks pretty good in my opinion. Remember, when you're doing this, you have to select the first keyframe. So now that you have that done, we can simply press Shift and select these 2 keyframes and then press Ctrl C to copy them. Then you can go to the next set position, and let's say the next letter starts bouncing from frame 90 itself. So we'll go to frame 90, select the second set position, hover over the Y, right click and press insert single keyframe, and then just press Ctrl V. Now we can do that again. Go to frame 110, select the next set position, go to the Y, click insert single keyframe, and then Ctrl V. Then do the same thing for the other ones. Make sure that when you're pressing Ctrl V, you bring your cursor to the actual timeline and then press Ctrl V. And when you are going to press Ctrl V, make sure you select the node. So you have to go to the frame, select the node, and then press Ctrl V. Otherwise, it's simply going to overwrite the data from your previous node itself. So once you have all of them keyframed, you can go ahead and play the animation to make sure that everything seems right. So each of the letters are bouncing one after the other, which is exactly what we want. So it seems that it's working fine, but it's also playing back at a slightly slower frame rate. So make sure that if you want to know the realistic speed at which it's animating, change this back to the timeline and just change the playback sync from play every frame to frame dropping, and that way you'll get a realistic idea of how fast these are actually bouncing up and down. So once you have that set, we can start off the actual animation of the sphere. So I'll press Shift A and search for a mesh icosphere. I'll scale it down till it's roughly the size that I want, and then I'll press Ctrl 2 to add in a subdivision surface modifier of level 2, and I'll click Object, Set Shade Smooth. And now before we animate this particular sphere, we want to make sure that our text is exactly how we want it, because once we animate this sphere, it'll be harder to make changes to our text because we'll have to reanimate the sphere. So maybe we can go back to the text and come down to the character spacing and increase that if you want, and make whatever changes you feel necessary. So I think I'm going to keep the character spacing at 1.1 itself, and then I'll select the sphere, and first we'll animate the X location. So I want the sphere to directly fall down on the first letter and then bounce to the rest of the letters and bounce off screen. So we'll animate the X separately and the Y separately. So we know that it has to land on the first letter at frame 70, because after 70 the first letter gets pushed down. So let's take our sphere on frame 70, press GX and drag it to the center of our first letter, and then come to our object properties over here, hover over the X and then right click and click insert single keyframe, or we can press this dot right next to the value and insert a single keyframe for that by just clicking it. Next, we want it to go and reach N exactly when N starts coming down, which is on frame 170. So we'll press GX, grab it all the way to the center of the N, and then add in the keyframe just by pressing this diamond over here. And now we should have an animation that goes through each letter at the right time, but clearly it's slowing down at the start, speeding up in the middle, and slowing down at the end. So to change that, we come down here and press T linear, and now it should go perfectly above each letter when each letter is pushed, which is exactly what we want. However, we don't want it to stop at N. We want it to continue falling down. So we'll go back from the timeline to the graph editor, select this node, go to the modifier, and then add in a cycles modifier. Now we want the repeat motion from before to have no cycles, And for after, we want it to have a repeat motion with offset. So that way it'll just continue moving in that direction. So this is exactly what we want for the sphere, and that looks good enough for me. Now we can actually start with the animation on the y-axis. So to do that, let's say on frame 70, we know that it should just reach the tip of the first letter. So we'll press G, Y and move it up to just about the tip. And then on the Y, we'll add in a keyframe. Then we'll go front by 20 frames because we know at frame 90, it should hit the E. We'll press GY and move it down till it's touching the E. And then we'll come here and add in the keyframe over there. Then we'll zoom in to the Y, and we also don't want to see the X anymore. So we'll just expand this and press this I button to hide the X. We want this to actually jump up in the middle. So if we actually look at this, it hits the D and then directly moves down to the E. We don't want that. We want it to go up and then come down. So we'll go halfway through the frames. So since this is 70 to 90, halfway through is 80, and at 80 it should reach its highest point. So we'll say GY and just move it up by a little bit. And then we'll come down here and press this triangle so that we have one more keyframe added in over there. And now you'll see that it starts off slowly before the bounce and it ends also slowly, as in it slows down before hitting the E. That's not how it would work. It would be the fastest right after the bounce, and it would also be the fastest right before hitting it. The kinetic energy would be max in these two regions. So to change that, all you have to do is select these two keyframes by shift selecting them and then tapping V and changing the handle type to vector. That way you see it'll start off fast, slow down at the topmost point and then go back down fast, which is exactly how it would have behaved in a real life situation. So that seems all right. Next, we need to actually copy this bounce. So we'll just select these two keyframes and then press shift D X so that it moves only on the X axis, and then move it till the keyframe reaches 110. Beyond that, because the first letter is much taller, I'm assuming that it goes this high. This particular keyframe shouldn't go that high, so I'll just grab it and press GY and move it down by a little bit so that the Y value is reduced. So now if we play the animation, this is what it looks like. So let's just see how the bounce is, and that's fine. I think it has to go even lower, so I'll select it, press GY and bring it down even more. So now that seems fine. Now I need to just copy these for all of the different letters. So I select this top keyframe, this keyframe, press shift DX and bring it till the next keyframe, which is at 130. Then again for 150, press shift DX and right there is fine. Then again for 170, press shift DX and then press shift DX again till 190. Now the thing is, after 190, it shouldn't just start moving in a straight line like that. It should continue falling down. So we'll just interpolate this particular direction and add in a keyframe, possibly by frame 200, which is pointed straight downwards. So we'll add in a keyframe, select it, and then press GY and drag it down. But again, we don't want this to be Bezier, so we'll press V and change this to vector and then continue grabbing it down till it's roughly straight. And we actually want it to more or less go down in a parabolic path and not a linear straight line. So I'll actually change it from vector to aligned, and then I'll rotate this by 90 degrees to make it like this. Then I'll scale it up and I'll just press GY and I'll move it down till this region becomes fairly smooth. And in case you want it to be smooth without having to play around with it too much, you can always just press V and make it automatic, and that way it will smoothen it out a bit. However, of course, the shape might not be perfectly natural, so you might have to play around with this a little bit more. Of course, it's all just taking this and grabbing it on the y-axis and moving it down till the motion seems right. So you have to play the animation, actually watch the ball fall down, and you have to figure out if the motion seems right to you. So once you have that set, you can actually start off with finishing the rest of the node tree in the geometry node. So we'll select the geometry node object, come back here, and after the curve to mesh, we'll just press shift A and search for a set shade smooth node and a set material node. So press shift A, search for set material and add that in after the set shade smooth. Now for this, we can select the default material itself, and then we can start with the scene setup. So for my scene setup, I'm just gonna press 7 to go into the top view, press Ctrl Alt 0 to snap my camera to view. Then I'll select the camera, go to the object data properties, change the X location to 0, the Y location to 0, and the Z location, I can just bring it in till the logo fits fairly well within the screen. So I think about this much is all right, but that way I don't get to see my sphere falling too much. So I'm actually going to bring it back just a bit so that I can see my sphere fall out of the screen, and that seems all right. We also have to select our light, press X and delete it because we don't need it. Then I'll press shift A and add in a background plane, S to scale it up, then GZ to move it down by just a little bit. And I'll select my camera, go to my camera properties, go down to viewport display and increase passport out all the way to 1. Then I'll switch off overlays, and this is what we have for our scene setup. However, I did forget to animate the sphere coming in, so let's just take care of that really quick. Let's select our sphere. Now we're gonna go back by a few frames, let's say frame 50. Again, we'll go to our object data properties, add in a keyframe for the Y location, and then take this keyframe and just press GY and move it up, and then press play, and it should fall perfectly in. Now, if you feel like it's falling too slow, then you take it and you can press S to change the size of the handle, and that way it'll also smoothen it out, so it'll actually fall a bit faster. But along with that, you'll have to select this one and just scale it down accordingly by grabbing it and just moving it down. So by playing around with this, you can actually get the exact motion that you want. So just make sure that you're happy with whatever it ends up with. Now that you have all of that set, let's continue with the actual texturing. We can change this back to the timeline and then change this from the geometry node editor to the shader editor. Now with the geometry node object selected, which is our default cube, we should get the material to pop up. If you can't find it, press period on your num key to bring everything into the center. Now we'll change this material name to text, and we're actually going to animate the text according to the ball. So the first thing that I want to do is go to the world and increase this down to a black, switch my viewport shading to rendered so that I can actually see it. I'm going to actually change my world all the way to white, and I'm going to select the background plane, add in a new material, call it background, and I'm going to change the base color all the way to black and increase the metallicness all the way to 1. I'll play around with this in a while, but for now this should do. Then I'll select the cube and start playing around with the base color and everything. So I want the base color to remain a complete white itself, but I want the emission to be a nice bluish color, and I'm going to increase the emission strength to something like 80. And I see that I haven't set my render defaults, so I'll go to my render properties, switch on bloom and screen space reflections. Now for my bloom, I'm going to just clamp it down at 4, and I'll change the intensity down to 0.02. Next, I'll press shift A and search for a math node so that I can control the strength, and I'll plug that into the emission strength. I'll change it from add to multiply, and I'll multiply it by the value that I had given, which was 80. Now for this, I'm going to actually control it using a gradient texture, so I'll press shift A and search for a gradient texture and a color ramp node so that I have control over the gradient texture. And with the node wrangler switched on, I'll just alt right click these, alt right click these, and I'll change this from linear to constant so that it's a very steep drop off. I'll bring the white in by quite a bit. Then with the node wrangler selected, I'll select the gradient texture and press Ctrl T and change this from generated to object. Next, to actually visualize the gradient texture, I'll Ctrl Shift click the gradient texture with the node wrangler switched on, and you can see the gradient is going from black to white on each of the different letters. So to fix that, you can actually change this from object to camera, and now it's just going to go from left right of the camera view, which is all right for what we're doing. We'll Control Shift click the principled BSDF again, and if you're still not seeing any change this from alpha to color, because obviously we want the color of the color ramp and not the alpha value. So then we'll go back to the point where the ball just touches the first letter, and we'll change the location on the x-axis of the mapping node till everything is switched off. So right now you see if we change it, we can get everything to switch on from the right, but we want it to switch on from the left. So to flip that, all we do is change the rotation on the z-axis by 180, and now if you play around with the x, it should behave as you want, going from left to right. So we'll move it back till everything is switched off, and then we'll press I, after which we'll go to the next frame and we'll change this till exactly only the first letter is lit up. Then we'll press I. Then we'll go all the way to frame 90, which is just before the ball hits the E, and then we'll hover over it and press I. Then we'll go to frame 91 and increase this till just the E is lit, and then we'll press I. We'll continue doing the same for all of the other letters as well. So let's go to frame 110, keep it at the same place, and if you've changed it, just select this and press Shift D and move it all the way to 110, and then go to frame 111, increase this till A is lit, tap I. Continue to frame 130, tap I, go to frame 131, increase it till the Y is lit, and then tap I. So once you've done that for all the letters, it should look like the ball is what's switching the letters on and actually making them light up, which is exactly what I want. But I want the ball to also be lit by itself, so I'll just select the ball, give it a new material, remove the principled BSDF by pressing X after selecting it, and then pressing Shift A and searching for an emission node and plugging this into the surface. Now I'm going to change the color to that bluish color, but I'm going to keep it fairly desaturated, and I'm going to increase the strength to something like 100, and that seems all right. You also have to make sure that the sphere does exit the screen at both the start and the end, and if it doesn't, just play around with the keyframes till you pull it down so that it doesn't affect the edge of the screen. Right now we do have the bloom coming in, so ideally I should move it out, but I think it's all right. Next up, we have to play around with the background, so let's select the plane and give it another gradient texture. So press Shift and search for a gradient texture and a color ramp so that we can actually play around with the colors. Plug the color into the factor and Control T the gradient texture with the node wrangler switched on so that you get the mapping and texture coordinate nodes. If you don't have node wrangler, just add them in manually, and then connect the object to the mapping. Then if you plug this color into the base color, you should be able to see a gradient from the left to the right, but we want this to be from the top to the bottom. So we'll just change the rotation on the mapping by changing the Z value to 90. And then we'll change this black to a very dark bluish color, keep it very dark. And the white we can change to a complete black. Now, if you don't see the black, all you have to do is play around with the X location until you get a nice blend of the black and the blue. And if you feel like the gradient is too large such that you're still not able to see it, go to the scale value over here and just increase the scale until you can clearly see the gradient between the dark values down here and the brighter values up here. Now you can play around with the brightness and everything by changing these values, but I'll do all of that just before rendering and I won't bore you guys with the fine tuning of that. Also, just before rendering, don't forget to switch on motion blur and increase the shutter all the way to 1 just to add in some more effects. And with that, there's actually nothing else that's left for you to do except for coming up here and pressing render animation. Hopefully you learned something informative from that video and it'll help you get a grasp of the graph editor. That's a very powerful technique that can be used to add in quite a bit of life to your animations, and it makes animations like this bouncing ball a lot easier than it would have been if you were manually keyframing. Each method has its own advantages and disadvantages, but I think this one was worth learning, and if you thought the same, check out other videos on my channel because I upload a video every single day and there's a lot of content on my channel that's just waiting for people to watch it. Until the next video comes out tomorrow, thank you so much for watching, keep creating and stay creative.